Not so long ago, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization celebrated its 75th birthday, strengthened by its unity over Ukraine and the accession of 2 new member states. But only a few months of Donald Trump's second term in office were enough to make that confidence almost disappear. Which way is NATO heading? Stay with me to find out, here on Wider View. And I'm your host, Mateusz Mazzini. Good evening. Our main story tonight examines the state of NATO ahead of the summit in The Hague. For years, the meeting of the heads of states of the member countries was seen as a regular event with few serious consequences. Even when commitments were made, like in 2014 in Newport, to raise spending to 2% of GDP, many politicians refused to take them seriously. Talk did not necessarily translate into action. This time, everything is different. Russia is continuing its aggression against Ukraine and building up military capacities on NATO's eastern borders. Vladimir Putin is making open threats towards the collective West. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's approach to the alliance seems to be solely based on finances. America is no longer interested in multilateralism, and money alone may not fix that problem. With Europe and the US drifting apart, Russia threatening an invasion, and internal differences, where is NATO heading? We take a closer look in our report.
Before the leaders of NATO member states gather in The Hague on June 24th, there is still work to do. Much of it will have to be done by Mark Rutte, the current Secretary General. It will be his first time hosting a summit, and he'll be doing so in his home country. But it's certain he would have preferred a much calmer international environment. The former Dutch Prime Minister is currently visiting different NATO countries, echoing the same message everywhere.
Morning.
Trump wants other member states to spend more, and they need to deliver, at least on paper. The target is 5%, but it is not a realistic goal for many to meet anytime soon. A number of European countries still oscillate around 2% of GDP spent on defense, and they have little fiscal space to increase that. But not meeting the demands of the US administration could be disastrous for the whole alliance. Trump never officially declared his intention to leave NATO, but this is no reason for optimism. He does not have to formally abandon the alliance to make it much weaker. Now, when a scenario in which Russia invades a member country is no longer fiction, many remember a fundamental feature of this institution. Triggering Article 5 is not a military, but a political decision. Nothing in the treaty makes the defense of an allied country automatic. Vladimir Putin knows that very well, and so does Donald Trump. But it seems that some European leaders prefer not to think about a future where conflict becomes reality.
Is there life for NATO without American domination? How can Europe share the burden of collective defense effectively? And what is Donald Trump going to do in The Hague? We're approaching a critical moment in the history of the alliance, and we want you to be prepared for it. To answer questions as to what to expect from the summit in The Hague, we invited Emma Ashford, Senior Fellow at the Stimson Center. Emma, good evening and welcome to Wider View.
Thanks so much for having me.
Emma, I wanted to start with sort of a general question / a general assumption, if you please. Would it be correct to say that this is going to be the single most important summit in the most recent history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization?
It's hard to say that. I mean, I do think there have been some other significant summits recently. If we look at last year, I think it was the NATO summit that was the final nail in the coffin for Joe Biden's presidential re-election campaign. And we've certainly seen other summits after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine that were very effective and very important. But this will, I think, give us some indication of how the Trump administration intends to handle NATO going forward, and whether the spending increases that have been talked about are actually going to placate the administration or not.
So you talked about spending, and we know that this is going to be a fundamental issue also within the European group of allied countries. But broadly speaking, I know this is going to be one major speculation, at least for now. But if we were to make a bold hypothesis, what is going to be the strategy of the American delegation for the summit? Is it just going to be asking Europeans to pay up more and nothing else?
So I think this is one of those areas where we don't have a clear picture. What we do know is that the administration is demanding higher spending, significantly higher spending, right? At first, people thought that 5% of GDP spending targets was in many ways sort of a Trump off-the-cuff remark or even a joke, but actually it's become quite clear the administration is pushing this seriously, this 5%. So we know that that part of it is going to happen. What we do not know then is whether that is going to be matched by other asks from the administration to focus on capabilities, European interoperability, things that would enable the US to actually draw down troop deployments in Europe, or whether the spending targets will suffice for now.
So let's talk about the multilateral approach here a little bit, because on the one hand, we do have an American president that's openly asking European allies to spend more on defense. And for all intents and purposes, there seems to be quite a consensus in Europe that, well, Europe has to pay up, has to increase the share of GDP in spending. But at the same time, we have received a lot of different pieces of communication, let's call it that way, official or not, from various members of the American administration. Pete Hegseth, J.D. Vance, Mike Waltz, who is obviously no longer with the administration, not being happy to bail out the Europeans or hating to do so. Is this going to play a part in how Europeans will be negotiating with Americans in The Hague, do you think?
I think it has been clear since pretty much inauguration that this time around, Europeans are going to have to take Trump seriously on NATO burden sharing and burden shifting. This is a difference from the first term, where I think Trump himself said a lot of things about NATO that were not then echoed by his advisors, who often had very different views on this kind of thing. This time around, Trump is clear, his advisors are clear, we need to see more spending. The question is, what is going to be enough spending? What does it have to be spent on? And to what extent will that change Trump's views about NATO or not? I do think it's interesting that we saw Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth giving a speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue out in Asia just last week, in which he actually lauded European allies for stepping up on spending and asked Asian allies to do the same. So clearly, this is gaining some traction inside the administration.
But do you think, especially focusing on Hegseth himself, could it be true that this was just a point of leverage, that he traveled to Asia to pressure the Asian allies to beef up their own defenses because the Europeans have been already, frightened into doing so or pressured into doing so, and that doesn't really have any symbolic value beyond being a pressure point?
I think it's a pressure point. I think the administration actually just has a very clear rhetorical strategy here, and a practical strategy, which is pushing allies through whatever means are needed to actually step up and assist the US or take on some of the burden for defense. And we're seeing that, to a slightly lesser extent in Asia, more in Europe, and to some extent in the Middle East. And so I think they're just being very consistent. But it's still, I think, significant that Hegseth praised Europe for stepping up. I think, to me, that's a sign that the administration thinks Europe is at least moving in the right direction.
Okay, so let's talk about the past and the present a little bit, because you yourself mentioned the first Trump administration, in which there was a lot of cacophony between Trump himself and his advisors. And in fact, one of his former advisors, the national security advisor, John Bolton, is one of the most critical voices within the US establishment right now with regards to the US policy towards NATO. And Bolton has a very clear view as to where America is heading with its current strategy. Let's hear from him, giving an interview just a few months ago.
With us on the side of Russia and North Korea and countries like that, that shows the NATO alliance is badly split already. And it's at this point, you take too many more steps like that, the actual withdrawal is just a formality.
So given that we have John Bolton, who was obviously at that point in time commenting on the UN resolution trying to condemn the Russian aggression into Ukraine, being quite straightforward that this is a path into leaving the alliance. Is there a split within the current administration among certain officials trying to be more, let's say, aggressive towards European allies and some trying to reassure them that America is actually not going to leave? Is this a consistent administration, as you pointed out?
I mean, look, there's always factions inside any US administration. I think here the division is between those who want to, prioritize Asia and encourage European allies to do more, but stay within the framework of the NATO alliance in order to do it. And then those who are perhaps more willing to be a little more radical and to talk about things that there may be other disagreements on, right? Whether that is trade, whether that is J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference, talking about shared values and free speech and some of these other issues that American conservatives have really honed in on. So, I mean, I think, everybody agrees European states need to do more. But some people definitely still see a role for the US inside the alliance. This is not necessarily a path to full US withdrawal.
So if you were to sketch out a little bit for our viewers, who are the most influential players within the current American administration, especially those who advocate America staying inside NATO, just playing a different role? And again, what kind of a role would that be?
So we've seen again in this administration that there are foreign policy players who look quite different to the last time around, right? Last time around, Donald Trump really struggled to staff up his administration. He had a lot of very traditional Republicans, US sort of Washington foreign policy elites, and that's mostly not who's staffing the administration this time. This time, these people are largely committed to Trump himself, to his project and foreign policy, etc. So, what the people are saying, so J.D. Vance, I would say the vice president and those around him are very keen to see burden shifting to Europe and the US to focus more on China. We've seen calls in certain parts of the conservative ecosystem for what's described as a dormant NATO. So that is to say the US acting as a balancer of last resort rather than first resort, right? So you wouldn't have US troops on the front lines in Eastern Europe necessarily, but they'd be there if they were actually needed in some future hypothetical conflict. So that viewpoint is in there as well. And then there are others for whom I think this is genuinely mostly a spending question.
So taking all that into consideration, let's shift our discussion a little bit back to Europe. Because we know as much as we can possibly know about the American administration, but do you think there is going to be enough consensus among the European member states of the alliance to actually please the American delegation in The Hague?
I mean, this is always the problem, as you all well know, that Europe is, not an entity, right? It is a collection of states who have different priorities, different interests, and that has always made coming to consensus on these issues extremely difficult. Frankly, I think there's been an impressive amount of consistency and consensus among European states, first on the question of Ukraine over the last few years, but on spending since the Trump administration has come into office. Where I think we're likely to see issues with the administration is whether they decide to make an issue of states such as Spain, for example, that really has no intention of dialing up spending. And they don't need to, right? They're so far away from the trouble. They don't really want to spend scarce resources on this. It's not clear if the administration will be happy with just Poland and the Baltic states and, the big countries, Germany, France, Britain. Is that enough? If those states increase their spending, I mean, from a practical point of view, that's what you need for European defense, right? Or will Trump be insisting that every state has to meet these targets? And that's going to be a much more difficult lift.
Well, should that scenario actually materialize, then I guess Europe will be in much bigger trouble because, as you pointed out, there is a number of states who are very reluctant or have no fiscal space to increase spending. But the very central figure, and I guess we both agree on this, in the whole plot to increase European spending on defense would be Secretary General Mark Rutte, who is right now, as we speak, touring a number of member states trying to forward the exact same message. Beef up your spending because this is what the Americans want. In fact, let's hear from Mr. Rutte himself.
We have the confidence, commitment and courage to do whatever it takes to protect our way of life. There are no second chances when it comes to our security. So we will deliver in The Hague. Friends can be frank with each other, and there will be tough decisions to take. But let us not lose sight of what is at stake. The security of 1 billion people on both sides of the Atlantic. Together, we will secure peace through strength. Together, we will make our alliance stronger, fairer and more lethal. And together, we will build a better NATO.
A quick and stark question. Do you think he is going to deliver?
I think it's probable that he will be able to deliver some kind of symbolic pledge, right? I don't think he's going to get states to be able to agree to binding targets, certainly not at the numbers that he's suggesting. I mean, we've already seen the United Kingdom come out in the defense review and say that they're going to go for 2.5%, maybe 3%, but they can't do more. So I think what we're more likely to see is some kind of very thinly worded statement that states pledge to move towards these targets. And the ones that Rutte has really been trying to sell as he goes around Europe is 3% or 3.5% of spending on defense and 1.5% on related things like infrastructure that enable that defense. And so that's how he gets to this 5% figure. But I think, again, the devil is in the details. Will states actually be able to follow through on these pledges? And right now, to me, it's not at all clear that that's the case.
But when Secretary General Rutte says what's at stake, it's the collective security of 1 billion people, he also takes into consideration the security of the Americans and the Canadians. Do you think that message will resonate well on the other side of the Atlantic?
I don't think so. I mean, certainly with some Americans it will resonate well, but I don't think this administration is persuaded by such arguments. If you remember the infamous incident in the Oval Office with Trump and Zelensky and Vice President Vance, we saw, Zelensky say, well, America will eventually be in trouble and your oceans won't protect you from Russia, and so we're fighting for you. And Donald Trump shot that argument down extremely fast. So I think people in Washington, in the administration, I think, have a very clear view of US security, which sees Europe as important, but not something that is Russia is not an imminent danger to America in the same way that it is to Poland or even to other countries in Europe.
So after almost 6 months of Donald Trump in office, what can we say of Mark Rutte as the Secretary General of NATO? He was rumored, expected, believed to be a very efficient Trump whisperer. Is it still justifiable to refer to him as such?
He seems to be doing quite well so far, I would say. Again, if he does not manage to deliver something, even a rhetorical commitment at this summit, that may prove more difficult. But I think he's done a very good job of taking the administration's messaging on board and trying to provide them something that will actually assuage their concerns. I personally was not entirely sure that would be the case, particularly given Rutte's own history in the Netherlands and his government's inability to spend enough on their own defense. But he seems to, in the NATO role, be pushing much more strongly for spending. And I think that's being received well in Washington.
Well, again, words of optimism on your behalf, but let's move away from the context of the current upcoming NATO summit in The Hague, and let's talk broadly speaking about the future perspective of the alliance. There are other challenges that NATO is facing beyond the shaky American commitments. What are the most important things that Rutte will have to focus beyond the summit in the Netherlands?
This is a really good question because, to be honest, while I think this summit is going to be important and the vibes, the sense that we get from it is going to tell us a lot about where the administration wants to go, it's not going to resolve a number of the bigger issues on the table. We have still got the Ukraine question, right? The coalition of the willing, so-called, in Europe has not really been able to come to any kind of consensus on what they might provide to Ukraine. There's been a lot of talking about troop deployments that haven't really happened. And so there's that problem. There's the question of, as European states rearm, what is the trade-off between arming Ukraine versus arming oneself? That's a choice that Poland, obviously, Romania, and others have made quite clearly that they're going to focus more on their own defense at this point. So that's going to be an issue. And then I think, just writ large, will the alliance actually be able to get member states to follow through on this spending? I mean, what we saw with the Germans, with the Zeitenwende, was a series of very impressive promises that didn't really end up providing significant military capacity or capabilities. And so if that plays out again with other NATO member states, we could be in the same situation in a few years where, it's obvious the spending is not happening.
So again, moving a little bit beyond the context of the summit, Americans, especially with the current administration, are growing more skeptical about any form of multilateral engagement. And we're perfectly aware of how powerful the presence of American military in Europe is. But it's not just about the military. We see right now on the screen the map of nuclear facilities in Europe. There was a lot of talk about America pulling out some of the troops. Do you think nuclear facilities are also under threat and could possibly be relocated outside of the continent?
I think it's certainly, again, on the table in this administration, though I don't believe they've made any decisions on this question. But again, there is an internal split. There are those who argue that the US should pull back many of its forward deployed troops while keeping its nuclear commitments to the continent. But there are others who argue, I think the more classic argument here is that that's simply not a credible commitment. So, we again have this split. And I think what we would be more likely to see the administration pull out, at least in the short term, would be sort of frontline troops that might be of more use elsewhere. So say battalions that are in Germany, for example, or rotating through various places in Eastern Europe that might be of use in other theaters. We might see them take that as a step.
And finally, Emma, a start question, but not an easy one. Is it a realistic future to see NATO without any form of American involvement, perhaps including a formal procedure, formal decision to leave the alliance?
I don't think the United States is likely to leave NATO formally. I do think, the options range from, a fairly involved still America that has troops on the continent. So that would be Trump basically not achieving his goals in this space, ranging over to, an America where, there are still Americans present in Brussels in some roles. The US is nominally a member of the alliance, but most of the defense decisions are taken by, let's say, a European Supreme Allied Commander, right? And most of the troops are provided by European states. That, to me, seems like the range of realistic possibilities right now, barring some catastrophe. I don't see any political appetite for a complete withdrawal, and it strikes me as something that would be fairly politically unpopular, whereas these, dormant NATO, hollow NATO ideas, those are fairly popular with the American people.
So I guess we were all hoping for some guidance and clarity as to what to expect from the American delegation going into the summit in The Hague. But it seems to be the case that chaos, or at least consistency in chaos, is going to be a perennial feature of the times of Trump. Emma Ashford was our guest tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
There is a lot of uncertainty going forward when it comes to the future of NATO. The alliance needs, however, to be conflict-ready as soon as possible. Times are changing. Events are moving fast. History would not wait for anyone to persuade their voters to spend more on defense. It is, quite literally, now or never. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we will take a closer look at one of the most pressing issues facing today's democracies: the role of the courts and tribunals. Make sure you're with us next Thursday, follow us on YouTube, and have a good evening.